There are places in this world where nature doesn't follow the rules we learned in books, wild territories where silence doesn't represent peace, but rather a silent warning that something much larger than us inhabits those lands. I spent most of my professional career dealing with extreme situations in places that most people couldn't even locate on a world map, even with all the time in the world. I worked on complex rescue operations, recovery missions in hostile environments, and cleanup procedures in scenarios that defy any conventional logic. But nothing, absolutely nothing I had experienced before could adequately prepare me for what I found in the frozen vastness of Alaska. That frozen territory has a unique ability to completely transform a person's essence. They say that the first element that starts to affect your mental sanity is precisely the oppressive silence that permeates every square inch of that white immensity. It's not just the absence of everyday sounds we know, but a deep and disturbing quietude that seems to extend infinitely in all possible directions. The landscape appears too vast for human comprehension, too white for eyes to adjust, and too still to seem natural. Gradually, you develop an unsettling feeling that the territory itself is watching your every move, analyzing your decisions, patiently waiting to witness the exact moment you make a fatal mistake. My full name is Marcus Sullivan, and before becoming what I am today, I served with distinction in the Air Force as a specialist in advanced survival techniques in extreme environments. Currently, the federal government contacts me exclusively when extraordinary situations arise, events that completely challenge conventional scientific explanations and simply cannot be justified through normal investigation channels. These are occurrences that escape the established patterns of nature, anomalies that need to be investigated discreetly, away from the curious eyes of the civilian population and the sensationalist press. In that particularly harsh winter, I received an urgent summons to head to a small community called Willow Creek, located north of the city of Anchorage. It was a tiny village, practically forgotten by the rest of the world, strategically squeezed between the frozen banks of the Yentna River and the imposing elevations of the Tordrillo Mountain. When I first observed the place through the aircraft window during the landing approach, the community seemed absolutely peaceful and picturesque, like one of those old calendar photographs, perfectly preserved and frozen in time for decades. However, the moment my aircraft finally touched the snow-compacted runway, I immediately realized that something was profoundly wrong in that. The airfield was completely deserted, without a single human in sight. There were no lively conversations among workers, no noise of running engines, no sign of normal human activity. There was only the solitary and disturbing sound of my military boots crunching the hardened snow under my feet, echoing unnaturally in that absolute void. It was as if life itself had been sucked out of that place, leaving only an empty and silent shell behind. The briefing room in the regional office facilities in Anchorage was even colder than the outside environment. The grey walls seemed to absorb any trace of human warmth, creating an oppressive and uncomfortable atmosphere. Director Nathan Pierce, a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had already witnessed too much, slid a worn manila folder across the metallic surface of the table without uttering a single word. His gaze said everything I needed to know before even opening that file. Inside the folder, I found photographic documentation of 5 individuals who had disappeared over the last 45 days. All these disappearance cases had occurred along a specific corridor known as the Glacial Route, near a trail called Sendero del Oso, within the boundaries of Wrangell State Park. Each individual dossier contained basic information about the victim, their last known locations, and the circumstances of the disappearance. But what really caught my attention was the identical final annotation that appeared in 4 of the 5 files, written in hurried red pen: disappearance without evidence of physical confrontation or struggle. The 5th file, however, presented a completely different and infinitely more disturbing observation. The words were underlined 3 times, as if whoever wrote them wanted to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Hematic substance located on snowy surface. Dispersion pattern incompatible with documented attacks by regional predatory fauna. I questioned Director Pierce if there was a possibility we were dealing with a territorial grizzly bear, or perhaps a particularly aggressive pack of wolves. He simply kept his gaze fixed on me for long seconds, without blinking, without responding. The silence stretched uncomfortably until he finally broke that tension. His voice came out low, almost a hoarse whisper. The locals report nocturnal vocalizations that they describe as bones being slowly fractured. We discovered drag marks leading into the frozen tundra, and then they simply cease. as if they evaporated into the air. He paused deliberately before continuing, choosing each word carefully. Whatever is inhabiting those elevations, it's not leaving identifiable tracks for long enough for conventional tracking. The operational instructions I received were direct and unsettling in their simplicity. I should travel with minimal equipment, maintain absolute radio silence except in critical emergencies, and report exclusively when I obtained concrete and irrefutable proof of what was causing the disappearances. This specific type of guidance sounds routine and bureaucratic on the surface, until you stop to reflect on how many agents sent on similar missions actually returned carrying the requested proof. The statistical response is uncomfortably low. I left that government office carrying the folder under my arm, while snowflakes fell from the darkened sky like visual static around the artificial lights of the runway. The cold penetrated through my high-quality thermal gloves, burning the exposed skin with its brutal intensity. I had been sent before to track and investigate inexplicable phenomena, creatures that defied conventional zoological classification, but something in that particular silence seemed to follow me like an invisible shadow when I left the building. The director's words echoed persistently in my mind. They categorically stated that it was not a conventional predator following known behavioral patterns. They said the entity moved like smoke sliding against the snow, without apparent physical substance, without leaving tangible evidence of its passage. The next morning, I woke up before the first rays of sunlight touched the frozen horizon. I organized my equipment methodically and efficiently, then drove my vehicle north, leaving Anchorage behind. The highway was practically deserted at that early hour. Just me, the constant rumble of the diesel engine, and the oppressive grey sky pressing down on the distant mountains like a physical weight. Fresh snow danced across the road in long, sinuous white ribbons, completely erasing the tracks of my tires as quickly as I created them, as if nature itself wanted to ensure that no one could follow my path back. Every few kilometers traveled, I caught myself instinctively glancing at the tree line bordering the road. Something in that landscape seemed fundamentally incorrect, unnatural in a way I couldn't fully articulate. The silence was too deep, too absolute. There were no crows circling the sky in search of carrion, no fresh moose tracks in the snow-covered ditches, just an endless expanse of ice, and a quietude that seemed alive, conscious, observant. Around noon, I finally reached the ranger station located at the edge of the Willow Creek administrative area. The building looked semi-abandoned, with the roof completely buried under thick layers of accumulated snow and only a single window emitting a faint, yellowish glow through the grey dimness of the day. It was there that I met Ranger Sarah Blackwood, a woman of about 47 years, with partial Tlingit ancestry visible in her striking. She was the type of person whose appearance immediately conveyed that she had spent her entire existence facing the relentless cold of Alaska, and yet had never truly made peace with that brutal reality. Her waterproof coat was zipped up to her chin, and her eyes carried a specific type of exhaustion that had absolutely nothing to do with lack of sleep, but rather with the psychological weight of having witnessed things that defied rational explanation. When I identified myself as a specialist in wildlife damage control sent by the federal department, she showed no surprise at all, just a palpable relief that finally another person was present to witness what she had been desperately trying not to believe. With hands that trembled slightly, she unrolled a detailed topographic map on the worn reception counter. Her fingers hesitated momentarily before pointing to a specific extension along the snowy ridge trail. Her voice came out low and laden with contained emotion when she began to explain. It was precisely here that the first hiker disappeared without a trace. Then came another, and yet another. They all belonged to different groups, with distinct itineraries, but they were invariably heading to the same elevated rock formation. She swallowed hard before continuing, and I could see the difficulty she had in verbalizing what she had been observing. We completely stopped sending volunteer search teams to that region after the last incident. The entire forest became silent in a way I've never witnessed in 30 years working these lands. Her voice faded at the end of the sentence, as if pronouncing those words aloud gave a tangible weight to the reality she would prefer to deny. I asked if there had been any recent sightings of large predators in the area, bears emerging prematurely from hibernation, wolf packs expanding territory, even the remote possibility of a cougar crossing the region. Sarah shook her head firmly in denial. If there were any conventional predator operating in that territory, the birds would have returned weeks ago, she replied with absolute conviction. But they haven't returned. None of them. That specific observation stuck in my mind with particular force. Birds always return first after environmental disturbances, unless their primal instincts detect something that we humans cannot perceive. I thanked Sarah for the valuable information, took an additional local map she offered, and began my journey toward the trailhead before the sun started its descent behind the distant. The snow was deep, easily reaching knee-height, and heavy with frozen moisture, producing a distinct crunching sound under each laborious step. The coniferous forest swallowed any sound in all possible directions. It's extraordinarily difficult to adequately convey the specific type of quietude that inhabits those remote altitudes. It's not peace or tranquility in the conventional sense we know. It's psychological atmospheric pressure, an almost tangible force. It's the type of absolute stillness that physically presses against your eardrums until you inevitably start imagining movements in the periphery of your vision, shadows that shouldn't exist, invisible presences watching your every move. Each exhalation left a cloud of condensed vapor that remained suspended in the cold air for an excessively long time, as if the atmospheric cold itself was reluctant to release it, keeping it trapped as evidence of my presence in that forbidden territory. After traveling approximately 800 meters into the trail, I stopped abruptly. Something had disturbed the perfect uniformity of the fresh snow blanket. Two long parallel impressions cut through the frozen ground in an absolutely linear fashion. They weren't animal tracks following organic locomotion patterns that I would immediately recognize. They were too deep, too clean at the edges, following a perfectly straight line instead of the alternating pattern characteristic of quadrupedal walking. The first visual impression suggested that someone had dragged a heavy sled through the area, but there were no pull marks, no return pattern, no evidence of equipment or harness. I crouched carefully, removing with my gloved hand the thin surface layer of newly formed frost. The edges of the impressions were sharp and well-defined, indicating recent formation. Whatever had created those grooves had passed through there a few hours ago, perhaps less. A few meters ahead, the snow showed a visibly darker coloration near a basalt rock outcrop. I approached with increasing caution. Thin veins of frozen blood substance spread across the irregular rocky surface, crystallized in dark, wine-colored vein patterns. There wasn't enough quantity to indicate death by exsanguination on sight, just enough to confirm that something alive had been injured there, something that bled red like any known mammal. I removed my photographic camera from the inner pocket of my coat and captured several documentary images from different angles, then began to follow the mysterious impressions wherever they. After approximately 30 meters of careful tracking, the marks simply ceased to exist, as if the entity that created them had literally lifted straight off the frozen ground and disappeared into the rarefied air of the altitude. The wind finally returned after hours of absence, whispering almost intelligibly through the treetops of the firs. A single branch creaked somewhere directly behind my position. I spun quickly with trained military reflexes, but there was absolutely nothing visible, just a pale and infinite horizon and the slow, hypnotic drift of falling snowflakes. I distinctly remember thinking how that quietude had returned again, how that particular silence seemed to follow me like a shadow that didn't need light to exist, a constant, an invisible presence. The impressions were deep and deliberate, but whatever created them left no return path. When I finally managed to return to the main highway, night had already completely swallowed the distant mountain peak. The drive to the small town of Healy seemed considerably longer than it should have been objectively. The road wound endlessly through black woods of dead trees and frozen lakes that reflected the starless sky. My vehicle's headlights carved temporary tunnels of visibility through the increasingly heavy falling snow. Every few minutes of driving, I caught myself instinctively checking the rearview mirror. I can't rationally explain why this compulsive behavior. Perhaps because I simply couldn't shake the persistent and disturbing feeling that something out there was moving precisely when I wasn't looking directly, following my vehicle at a calculated distance, watching, waiting, planning. The motel was isolated at the forgotten edge of the town, consisting of a row of only 7 rooms facing an empty parking lot covered in unremoved snow. The luminous sign in front of the establishment still blinked intermittently with the word vacancies, even though the entire place seemed completely abandoned for months, perhaps years. Inside the room assigned to me, the heating worked precariously, emitting weak mechanical clicks through an antiquated wall unit, and the pine-scented cleaning product smell barely masked the persistent odor of dampness and mold impregnated in the walls. I locked the door with bolt and chain, pulled the thick curtains until they were completely closed, and spread all my equipment across the small scratched wooden table. The map provided by Ranger Blackwood was open next to the photographs she had given me. 4 faces stared back at me through those printed images. 2 men of different ages, 2 women who didn't know each other, completely distinct groups with varied backgrounds. but one unquestionable connection united them. All were last seen in the vicinity of the ridgeline above Frozen Mirror Lake. I meticulously organized their individual files by time of disappearance. The first individual had disappeared in the morning, around 10 o'clock. The second case occurred in the late afternoon, approximately at 5:30. The third disappearance happened precisely at sunset. The last documented record marked exactly 2 hours and 42 minutes into the early morning, a person who disappeared while camping under perfectly clear and starry skies, without storm, without fog, without any meteorological phenomenon that could explain or obscure what happened. The entity wasn't waiting for the protection of darkness to act. It wasn't waiting for daylight to hunt. It was operating whenever it desired, following its own logic that I still couldn't decipher. I leaned back in the wooden chair that creaked under my weight, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the snowflakes softly tapping against the window like invisible fingers trying to enter. I picked up my digital field recorder, the one I had used during my conversation with Sarah earlier that day. I pressed the play button, and her voice emerged from the small speaker, soft but cracked at the edges by contained emotion. We completely stopped sending volunteer team. The entire forest became silent. I replayed that specific phrase 4 times in a row, paying attention not just to the words, but to the way she pronounced them. The way Sarah said silent didn't convey conventional fear. It conveyed deep mourning, irreparable loss. During all my years working on these classified missions, I repeatedly witnessed how fear manifests in wildlife. Genuine fear makes animals flee in panic. It makes them hide in deep burrows until the threat passes. But what was happening in those mountains wasn't strategic hiding. It was complete and total absence. The deer tracks near the ridgeline had completely ceased weeks ago, according to the records Sarah meticulously kept. The migratory and resident birds had disappeared without returning. Even the opportunistic scavengers, who are normally the last to abandon a territory, had evaporated. Conventional predators don't erase the forest from existence. They fill it with their dominant presence. They take what belongs to others through force and establish their territorial dominance. But this was different, fundamentally. I looked again at the scattered photograph. Each person had disappeared within a radius of a few kilometers from each other, but never in the exact same location twice. Whatever inhabited that territory was moving deliberately, possibly testing the limits of its expanded territory, perhaps learning and memorizing the behavioral patterns of those who ventured too far from the safety of civilization. A sudden gust of wind pressed against the window, with enough force to make the glass visibly shake in its frame. I froze instantly, eyes fixed on the closed curtains. In the next moment, absolute silence returned. No subsequent sound of impact, no echo of movement outside. Just the type of stillness I had left behind on that mountain ridgeline. I turned off the recorder and remained seated there, simply listening to the absolute nothing that surrounded me. The heater emitted a final click and ceased functioning. The room became considerably colder within minutes. I thought about those 2 long marks in the snow, how they had stopped abruptly midway, as if something had simply lifted straight from the frozen earth and vanished into the air. And for the first time since accepting this mission, I seriously wondered if I was already being watched, if whatever inhabited those mountains already knew of my presence and was patiently awaiting my inevitable return to its territory. Something new had taken possession of those mountains, and it clearly had no intention of leaving. I left the motel before dawn even broke the frozen horizon. The sky maintained that molten steel tone, the type of oppressive grey that completely devours any distinction between land and sky. The digital thermometer on the vehicle's dashboard indicated 23 degrees below zero, and the air penetrating through the ventilation openings carried a metallic odour mixed with suspended ice crystals. I drove continuously until the road turned into compacted gravel covered in ice and ended abruptly near Frozen Mirror Lake, exactly where the disappeared had been last tracked. The lake stretched before me, a white and motionless vastness, surrounded by twisted black firs and distant peaks that seemed like sleeping giants under eternal snow blankets. I exited the vehicle and began loading my specialized equipment, a state-of-the-art thermal camera, 3 motion sensors with satellite transmission, and my service weapon loaded with stopping ammunition. My breath condensed in the cold air, rising in slow spirals that froze midway and remained suspended like translucent specters watching my preparation. The silence hit me again with renewed force, more intense than before. I could distinctly hear the leather of my gloves creaking with each finger movement, the metallic click of the vehicle door closing, the muffled and rhythmic sound of snow being compressed under my boots, but absolutely nothing else. No crow cawing in the distance, no breeze moving the snow-laden branches, no natural sound that should permeate a living and functional forest. I followed the same ridgeline that Sarah had carefully marked on the topographic map. The official trail was completely buried under layers of snow accumulated over weeks, but faded markers still emerged from the white surface, like half-swallowed warnings by time and forgetfulness. Each step produced a peculiar echo in my ears, as if the sound was being artificially amplified by the landscape itself. After traveling approximately 800 meters, I observed something deeply disturbing near a cluster of twisted dwarf birch. A set of branches seemed bent in a completely unnatural way, twisted downward with enough force to partially break the wood fibers without completely separating them. I approached with increasing caution and identified a tuft of silvery grey fir stuck to the rough bark. I crouched slowly, pinching the material between my gloved fingers. The fir was extraordinarily stiff, almost wire-like in texture, completely different from any wolf or lynx pelage I had examined in decades of fieldwork. The coloration oscillated strangely between deep grey tones and pure white, as if it didn't organically belong to that landscape, but simply reflected it imperfectly, like a distorted mirror trying to camouflage itself. I carefully placed the sample in a sealed plastic bag for later analysis and began to meticulously examine the surrounding area. Approximately 3 meters away, an impression in the snow captured my immediate attention and made my stomach instinctively contract. At first glance, it looked like a paw print, wide and heavy, as would be expected from a large predator. But when I delicately removed the surface layer of newly formed frost, I revealed a distinct division crossing the center of the mark, similar to a cloven hoof. However, it was fundamentally incorrect in its structure. It was too long, too narrow in proportions, and the rear half was pressed deeply into the frozen ground, as if the creature carried significantly more weight in the back than in the front. The pressure distribution suggested something that was running in an upright posture, not dragging on 4 legs like any known animal. I captured multiple documentary photographs from different angles and illuminations, then crouched again for precise measurement. The edges of the impression were sharp and well-defined, recently frozen. Whatever had created that mark had passed through this location less than an hour ago, perhaps just minutes before. I remained completely still, carefully examining the white vastness around me. It was then that I noticed something that made every hair on my body stand on end under the layers of thermal clothing. My own breathing was creating dense clouds of condensed vapor in front of my face, twisting gently in the cold and still air. But then, another vapor cloud slid through my peripheral vision, coming from a completely different direction. For a fraction of a second, my brain tried to rationalize that it was simply my own exhalation being diverted by some imperceptible air current, but there was no wind at all, and the cloud had emerged directly behind my position. I turned slowly, every muscle tense and prepared for immediate reaction. There was absolutely nothing visible, just an endless field of untouched snow and tortured trees under an opaque and lifeless sky. No movement, no displaced shadow, no disturbance in the white uniformity. But the air around me seemed to have acquired a different density, heavier somehow, as if the frozen atmosphere itself was holding its breath in anticipation. A single crow cawed somewhere high above, the sound cutting through the stillness like a sharp blade through fabric. The call echoed off the distant rock formations, reverberating unnaturally. Then it ceased abruptly, in the middle of the vocalization, as if something had physically interrupted the bird. Absolute silence returned instantly, deeper and more oppressive than before. I raised the thermal camera, methodically sweeping through the tree line in a full 180-degree arc. No heat reading appeared on the monochromatic screen. No sign of life, just the deep blue of absolute cold extending infinitely in all directions. I should have felt relief with that negative result, but instead, I felt as if something was watching me from a place that my technological instruments simply couldn't detect, hidden in some frequency or dimension that remained invisible to my sensors. I began installing the motion sensors in the compacted snow, one near the frozen edge of the lake, another at the tree line where the forest became denser, and the third at the top of the rocky elevation. Their indicator lights blinked once in sequence, then stabilized into a steady and reassuring glow. For a brief moment, I remained there standing, surrounded by silent machines and infinite whiteness. The feeling was that the entire valley was listening attentively, patiently waiting for something to respond to my invasive presence. Even the sky seemed to be paying attention, the low and heavy clouds hovering motionless like mute witnesses. 2 days after installing the strategically positioned sensors, I received the call that would completely change the course of the investigation. A retired hunter named Thomas Whitmore had disappeared north of the rock formation known as Raven's Cliff, located just a few kilometers from where I had discovered the strange impressions. His adult son had gone out in search of his father and found the sled completely overturned, the leather harnesses cleanly and violently torn, and all 6 sled dogs simply disappeared without a trace. There were no canine bodies, no conventional tracks leading away from the scene, just a long stain of frozen blood substance in the snow leading toward the dense tree line. The local sheriff's voice on the phone line was low and laden with poorly disguised unease. "You're the federal agent, right? Then you should see this in person. Words can't adequately describe it." When I finally reached the incident site, the sky was already beginning to darken prematurely. As often happens in those extreme latitudes during winter, the air carried a distinct odor of oxidized copper mixed with pine resin. Ranger Sarah Blackwood was waiting beside the sled wreckage, and her appearance had visibly worsened since our last meeting. Her eyes were red and swollen, shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible physical weight, and it was obvious she hadn't slept properly for several consecutive days. We didn't exchange many words. There was no need. The snow around us told its own silent and terrifying narrative. The sled dogs hadn't fled in panic, as would be expected. They had been forcibly dragged, their desperate claws digging deep grooves in the ice as they tried in vain to resist. The frozen surface under the overturned sled was marked with deep ruts, as if something extraordinarily heavy had been pulled through it with brutal force. The creature's claws or hooves, frantically digging for traction. Sarah pointed with a trembling hand to the rocky elevation ahead, where the terrain broke into a chaotic tangle of ancient glacial formations. "That's where the blood trail leads," she said, in an almost inaudible voice. "It goes straight to a cliff. The locals claim there's an extensive cave system under that formation. No one goes down there during winter, ever." I methodically checked my equipment, service weapon loaded and locked, high-powered tactical flashlight, digital field recorder activated. Then we began following the red and frozen trail up the irregular incline. Each step produced a crunching sound that echoed back from the distant cliffs in a disturbing way. At the cave entrance, the wind died completely and abruptly, as if an invisible door had been closed behind us. The world narrowed to that dark opening, partially covered by ice stalactites hanging like irregular teeth. The odor hit first, a nauseating combination of organic decomposition, wet fur, and concentrated ammonia so strong it burned the nasal membrane. I directed my flashlight into the interior. The cave descended at a steep angle and curved to the left, the ice walls reflecting the light in distorted and shifting colors. On the uneven floor, half buried in a layer of frost, lay a torn sleeve of a dark green parka. Beside it, half of a rifle stock, cleanly broken through the middle as if snapped by superhuman force. Sarah crouched beside the wreckage, her fingers hovering hesitantly over the splintered wood. "This belonged to him," she whispered, with a voice broken by emotion. "He carved his initials right here in this mark." Her words came out laden with a pain that went beyond professional. The deeper we ventured into that claustrophobic cave, the louder our own breathing sounded in our ears. The beam of my flashlight trembled involuntarily against the icy walls, occasionally capturing tufts of fur stuck to the ice, some grey, others almost translucent white, as if something was changing its pelage while moving through those underground tunnels. A sudden sound broke the oppressive quietude, making both of us freeze instantly. Something was shifting in the depths of the cave, far beyond the reach of our light. It wasn't the sound of falling ice or dripping water. It was a slow and deliberate drag, like bone methodically scraping against frozen stone. Sarah gripped my arm with enough force to leave marks through the layers of clothing. Her lips barely moved when she formed the words, "It's still in here, with us." The sound came again, considerably closer this time. It no longer echoed in the distant depths. It was moving toward us with clear intent. I turned off my flashlight with a quick and precise movement. The darkness engulfed us completely and absolutely, so dense it seemed to have physical substance. For a few endless seconds, all I could hear was my own heart pounding violently against my ribs. Then something in the depths of that tunnel exhaled, long and heavy, like lungs that hadn't breathed properly for entire years. The breath carried that same decomposition odor, now intensified by proximity. Sarah's grip on my arm trembled uncontrollably. The smell grew stronger, almost suffocating in its intensity. We waited in absolute silence, barely daring to breathe. It was then that it responded to it. The echo that returned wasn't ours. It was something completely different, a vocalization that started as a low whistle, and gradually transformed into something that sounded disturbingly similar to a distorted human laugh, but produced by a throat that was clearly not human. We managed to exit that cave without looking back, moving as silently as possible. Neither of us uttered a single word until we reached the parked vehicle. Sarah lit a cigarette with hands that trembled so violently she needed 3 attempts to make the lighter work. Even with the cold wind hindering combustion, she inhaled deeply, as if that act could somehow purify her lungs of the death odor that still seemed to cling to us. I could still smell the putrefaction impregnated in my clothes, as if the cave had marked me permanently. That same night, I sent the fur sample I had collected near Frozen Mirror Lake to the federal lab in Anchorage. It took less than 24 hours for the results to return, and the moment I opened the encrypted digital report, I felt my stomach contract into a tight knot. The words on the screen seemed to pulse with ominous meaning. No genetic match found in existing databases. Under the technical observations column, a red marking blinked insistently. Red category, unknown morphology, hybrid anomaly detected. The genetic sequencing analysis revealed something that completely challenged established taxonomy. Half of the genetic markers aligned with known canid species: wolves, domestic dogs, coyotes. The other half corresponded to ungulates, hooved mammals like deer, moose, caribou. But the lab technician's note at the bottom of the report expressed the biological impossibility of what they were observing. The hybrid structure completely violates known mammalian taxonomy. We recommend immediate escalation to higher department. In more direct words, they had no idea what it was. I forwarded the complete file to Director Nathan Pierce's encrypted line. No response came, just a prolonged and deliberate silence. That specific type of silence meant one unequivocal thing. They already knew of its existence and had no intention of officially informing me. The next morning, I drove back toward the ridgeline. I needed to see what I had missed, what my eyes hadn't captured in the first investigation. The snow had settled again during the night, erasing all traces of the hunter's trail, but the forest itself seemed different somehow. The birches creaked louder in the wind, their white stems scraping against each other like dry bones. Half a kilometer into the trail, I found something that made me stop completely, heart racing. Deep claw marks etched into a birch trunk, located almost 3 meters above the ground, too high for any bear in an upright position. The grooves were sharp and irregular, still moist with fresh sap slowly dripping. Whatever had created those marks wasn't simply passing through. It was marking territory deliberately and aggressively. I remained there standing, staring fixedly at that mutilated tree, and my mind involuntarily returned to something that had happened years ago, a mission that still kept me awake on some nights. Brooks Range, year 2009. Another classified and urgent summons. A remote research outpost had been completely wiped out during a single night. No radio contact, no survivors to tell what happened. When our team finally arrived at the site, the snow was stained red in various spots, as if something had been dragged and buried under the surface. Impressions in the frozen ice, partially paw, partially hoof, following impossible patterns. We followed those tracks until our daylight completely ran out. My team partner had advanced for reconnaissance. His last radio transmission consisted of just 5 words uttered in a tone of absolute shock. "It's walking on 2 legs." We never found him. That case had been officially buried under maximum classification. Same pattern of evidence, same category of anomaly. I looked again at the marked tree, mentally tracing the height of the claw marks. My instinct told me this wasn't an isolated mutation or genetic accident. It was something that had been present before, something that returned cyclically. If the official files couldn't explain its existence, perhaps the mountains themselves could. That night, I methodically cleaned my tranquilizer rifle and organized only the equipment I'd carry. No additional support, no second escape vehicle, not this time. I informed Sarah to stay away from the ridgeline. She didn't argue or question. She just looked at me with that expression of someone who already knew I wouldn't return the same way. As I drove north again, the snow began to fall with greater intensity. The weather forecast had warned of a storm descending from the elevation, but I pressed on anyway. By mid-afternoon, clouds had completely devoured the sun, and the wind carried that characteristic smell of snow and oxidized iron. The trees bent under the weight of the relentless cold. It seemed like the entire mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't see, but could feel approaching. I reached the base of Raven's Cliff just before dusk. The same cave system that Sarah and I had penetrated was located a few hundred meters up the slope, half hidden behind ice curtains. The wind howled through the rock crevices, making it sound as if it were alive and conscious. I set up an improvised camp just below the entrance. A small camouflage tarp stretched between two rock formations. My tranquilizer rifle was loaded and ready at my side, sensors synchronized with my portable monitor. I had planned 12 hours of continuous observation, possibly more if necessary, but plans mean very little in that territory. When night finally arrived, the temperature plummeted brutally. My breath turned to glass in the cold air. Snow whipped across the ground in thin, cutting ribbons. The storm built in successive waves, first intense wind, then absolute silence, then wind again, like the irregular breathing of something gigantic. Around midnight, conditions had deteriorated to almost complete lack of visibility. My tarp vibrated violently, straining the fixing rope. I adjusted my telescopic sight, sweeping the dark shapes of the rocks above, everything blurred in shades of grey and white. Nothing moved visibly, nothing breathed besides me. Then the wind stopped mid-gust, as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. The type of silence that seems physical, pressing against the eardrums. Even the snowflakes seemed suspended motionless in the air, defying gravity. It was then that I heard it, a slow and deliberate drag through the hardened snow. Then another, closer. They weren't conventional steps. It was something being dragged, like claws or hooves, methodically scraping the ground, careful, calculated, intentional. I disengaged the rifle's safety, breath condensing against the sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when a shape began to move through the whiteness. It wasn't walking against the wind as would be natural. It was sliding through it smoothly and heavily, the snow curving around it instead of hitting it directly. Then I saw the eyes, two pale, almost silvery circles, cutting through the storm like alien headlights. They didn't blink. They just swayed sideways, measuring me, evaluating me, deciding. I fired once, missed. The dart whistled through the air and disappeared into the darkness. The creature didn't startle or retreat. It just shifted, slow and steady, and the snow stirred around it like smoke. Then came a growl so deep I felt the vibration in my chest before I actually heard it with my ears. The sensors began beeping in sequence, one after another, detecting movement from 3 different angles simultaneously. My monitor flashed with thermal signatures, all shifting, circling my position, but only one pair of eyes stared back at me fixedly. I dropped the monitor and gripped the rifle tighter. The growl deepened, transforming into a sound I'll never forget. A cross between a hissing whistle and a high-pitched scream. Then the ground shook violently. Snow exploded to my left as it charged. I barely managed to roll out of the way in time, sliding down the slope, while claws tore through the tarp exactly where I had been crouched seconds before. The wind roared back to life with renewed force, swallowing the sound of my accelerated heartbeats. I hit the lower elevation hard, shoulder first, and desperately crawled behind a rock formation. The creature moved above me, massive and quick, a shifting blur against the blizzard. Its breathing came in irregular bursts, loud, wet, uneven. I drew my service weapon and aimed through the wind. For a fraction of a second, the storm parted, and I saw its full outline for the first time. Long limbs bent at the wrong angles, shoulders too narrow, head too low, skin and fur mixed as if it hadn't decided what it wanted to be. It advanced, snow crushing under hooves that ended in curved claws. I fired once, twice. The second shot hit. It howled, a sound that cracked through the storm and echoed across the ridgeline like distant thunder. It staggered back, clutching its wounded shoulder, and for the first time, I saw it bleed, thick black blood vaporizing where it hit the frozen snow. Our eyes met through the blizzard, mine wide with shock and adrenaline. Its curved upward at the edges, lips peeling back to reveal long, wet teeth in something that could only be described as a smile. And then it turned, fading into the storm, leaving only the smell of decomposition and the sound of the wind rushing back to fill the silence. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared fixedly at the spot where it had been, where the snow was already quickly covering the dark stain it left behind. It bled black on the white snow, and smiled before disappearing completely into the frozen shadows of the mountain that I now knew would never be the same.